Autumn 1967 was the first time John Balaban came to Vietnam as a young war opponent. Here, he helped save children wounded in the war. He ended his volunteer work after 1.5 years. John thought that time would make him forget Vietnam, but he just couldn't explain why he was so haunted by the chanting melodies he once heard in Vietnam. He returned to Vietnam in 1971 and stayed until 1972. During this time, he traveled across central Vietnam and the Mekong Delta to collect folk poems or ca dao.
Bước xuống ruộng sâu mảng sầu em tách da, tay ôm bó mạ nước mắt hai hàng. Ai làm lỡ chuyến đò ngang, cho sông cạn nước. Cho sông cạn nước đôi đàn biệt ly.
His bond with Vietnam and Vietnamese folk culture was marked by the release of the bilingual folk poetry collection Ca dao Vietnam in the US in 1974. In 2000, John published his translation of 135 poems by the queen of Vietnamese Nom poetry, Ho Xuân Hương. It was a statement of his dedication to the Vietnamese culture. Together with his two Vietnamese friends, he founded the Vietnam Nom Preservation Foundation in 1999 and has been its president ever since.
Hello and welcome to Talk Vietnam. In our studio today, we're lucky to have Professor, poet John Balaban, author of numerous literary works that draw on his experiences in Vietnam. He's also the translator of numerous Vietnamese folk poems and collections of Ho Xuân Hương poetry, Spring Essence. In our talk with him today, we'll have a chance to understand how the fate has led an American poet to Vietnamese folk poetry and Nom script. We'll also have a better understanding of the beauty and value of Nom script, much of which has yet to be discovered. Please join me in welcoming Professor and poet John Balaban on Talk Vietnam.
Thank you.
Hi, John.
Thanks very much.
It's great to have you on the show.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Let's jump straight in and start with the story of how you first came to Vietnam. Can you tell me a little bit more about your time when you came to Vietnam during the war?
Right.
From what I remember, you were a conscientious objector to the military service during the wartime. Can you elaborate more on that?
During the war, I was a graduate student at Harvard University, and Robert McNamara, who was then Secretary of Defense, was invited to speak in Boston at the new Kennedy Institute. And the war was just coming into American consciousness. It was 1967, and people were worried about the numbers. One was hearing about civilian casualties in Vietnam. Americans don't mind going to war, but they don't like going to wars in which their own young men and women kill civilians. People were shouting very rude things to the Secretary of Defense, and it upset me. And I wrote to my draft board, local boards that have the names of young men who could go and fight, and I said I wanted to go to Vietnam, but I was opposed to the war and would not go to fight. So I went as a civilian, and I was supposed to teach linguistics at Đại học Cần Thơ in the Mekong Delta. So that's what brought me to Vietnam.
Yeah. From what I heard, you came and helped injured children.
Right. I came just before the Tet Offensive, and there was political turmoil in the South. Marshal Key and President Thieu were fighting for power. The universities weren't opening. And then when they did open, came the Tet Offensive in Can Tho, and the university where I taught was bombed. And I got wounded by shrapnel flying through the air, and then went to work for another agency. I was no longer a teacher of linguistics, but I became the representative for a group that treated war-injured children and evacuated those who could not be treated in Vietnam to hospitals in the United States. There was a group of very distinguished doctors who were opposed to the war as well, and I became their field representative.
So can you tell me maybe one story that's really memorable for you from that time?
As far as collecting oral poetry, kayao, that began because often I had to talk to parents about their children. So I would talk to their parents, carry paperwork to them, sometimes way out in the countryside. And, you know, I'd be standing at a ferry crossing and a boat would come by, you know, puttering along. And sometimes I'd see a woman with just her head really under a hat, and but a piece of song would be drifting out from that. Or there'd be some farmers gathered around a blind man playing a guitar along a Mekong River, and he'd be singing. And I had no idea what these things were. And I just remember there were beautiful songs. And then a friend of mine who worked in a news agency said, you know, you can read Vietnamese. Can you tell me what these poems are? Because the guy in our office says that if you want to learn anything about the Vietnamese, you have to know kayao.
Yeah.
So that's how I began. I was alone in the countryside, away from all other Americans, away from safety. And I would go up to people with my tape recorder and say, would you sing me your favorite kazao? And the amazing thing is that this is not a strange question. At least it wasn't in the Mekong Delta where I did most of my recording. People did. I recorded maybe 500 kazao.
Wow.
Yeah, and taped them all.
Professor John Balaban returned to Vietnam in 1971. He traveled everywhere with his tape recorder to meet people and listen to the folk poems and chanting songs.
Bước xuống ruộng sâu mảng sầu em tách da, tay ôm bó mạ nước mắt hai hàng. Ai làm lỡ chuyến đò ngang, cho sông cạn nước. Cho sông cạn nước đôi đàn biệt ly.
He went to Hue, Buôn Ma Thuột, Cần Thơ, and the Mekong Delta between 1971 and 1972. He recorded around 500 folk songs as sung by 35 people, including men and women, young and old.
7 năm rồi tàn phá nước Nam ta, nên anh vác súng sông pha, phận em là gái phận em là gái cửa nhà ruộng nương.
Professor John Balaban first published his work, Kazao Vietnam, a bilingual anthology of 49 Vietnamese folk poems in 1973, when he was just 30 years old. The collection was the first of its kind to introduce to Western audiences this important part of Vietnamese folk culture. The book was reprinted in 2003 with the help of Professor Trần Văn Khê to better convey the music in Vietnamese folk poets. John Balaban still keeps the recordings of 10 out of the 49 poems in the collection.
So you said this was 500 songs that you have recorded. And this was during the 1970s, right?
71,
and this was still
72.
The dangerous period.
It was dangerous. I was on an island near Mitau called Kong Phung, Phoenix Island. And I was recording there at night, one night. And you could always hear the pagoda bell going.
Yeah.
In fact, people regulated their breathing and their singing even against the rhythm of the bell, because it was going always, right? And but that night there was a battle right across the river. So, you know, traces were going overhead and you could hear a mortar. So I remember playing my tapes once at the BBC in London.
Wow.
And all that noise was in the background. Mortar fire, small arms fire, but no one stopped singing. I mean, the war was just across the river, but it wasn't where we were. And it wasn't an uncommon thing for those people any night of the week. What I did was record songs that had never been written before.
Mm-hmm.
You want to hear one of them?
Yes.
Okay, let me try.
I would love to.
I hope I can do this because it's been a long time. Shum Sài Gòn trái dại chớ cũ, nước men mom nước đổ phù sa, ngọt ngào ngọn lửa bát ngát hương thơm, hương lửa quê nhà. Họ hương lửa quê nhà, hương về quê mẹ, đậm đà tình thương.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, even in my bad singing voice,
That is
it's
beautiful. So more than 2 decades later, in 2003, you published a collection of Vietnamese folk poetry, right?
Right. I was surprised. I mean, around mid-1970s, when the first version of this book came out, I was delighted to see a review in Nhân dân. And I was delighted particularly because it said, how strange to learn that years ago there was an American walking around our countryside collecting cacao. And we've examined the book closely, it said, and we really can't find many mistakes. It was the last thing that I liked so much. Can't find many mistakes.
How has the poetry book, the Kazao poetry book, how was it received in the U.S.?
Cayao's been in what now? 3 editions, which for poetry in the United States is a sign of success. It's taught at some universities, and it's had a good life as a book.
Professor John Balaban collected and translated 135 poems by the Queen of Vietnamese Nom poetry. In order to convey the depth of each poem, Professor John Balaban experienced the life of a true Vietnamese. He traveled to the countryside to learn about the life of Vietnamese people. He tasted the foods that Ho Xuân Hương once used landscape to describe, like in the poem The Floating Cake. Spring Essence was first published in 2000, and after several editions, it still captivates audiences. To date, 25,000 copies of the book have been printed, making it a phenomenon in the U.S. poetry scene.
Có thể nói là cái bản dịch của anh Balaban là phản ánh được tương đối trung thành cái nguyên tác của Hồ Xuân Hương. Cái đặc điểm thơ Hồ Xuân Hương của chúng ta, tức là một bài thơ thông thường nó có mang 2 nghĩa, là 2 bài thơ vừa thanh vừa tục. Thế người dịch nếu mà không giỏi được cả ngôn ngữ và hiểu được cả tiếng Việt và giỏi về ngôn ngữ tiếng Anh thì khó mà truyền tải một lúc một bài thơ mà mang được 2 nghĩa như thế. Thì anh Balaban làm được cái chuyện đấy, là một cái nhà thơ và đồng thời là tìm ra được những cái hình tượng tương ứng trong tiếng Anh để đặt những cái dịch bài thơ tương ứng. Cho nên tôi nghĩ cái thành công của nó là nó phản ánh được cái tài năng và cái tính chuyên nghiệp rất là sâu của anh Balaban, cả trong nghiên cứu lẫn như trong thơ ca.
When you're translating a poem from a different culture, you have to often provide footnotes to understand what's going on. And we can't, not having that background, an American reader has to, read a lot more to understand it. We don't fully appreciate it immediately. It requires a lot more work, but I feel that I can get a lot of it. And I hope that I can study Nom more and Vietnamese someday and learn more about Vietnamese culture to understand it all.
What's really special, this is the first collection of poems to be printed in English, Vietnamese, and the Nom script. This is the first time the Nom script has been available in a true type font on computers, thanks to technology designed by experts from the Nom Foundation. The publication of Nom documents using digital technology has opened up opportunities to bring the Nom script to young audiences. Old Nom documents can also be displayed on computers for the first time.
Cái giỏi của bác ấy chính là cái chỗ giỏi là của một cái thời đại mới bây giờ, thời đại làm việc tri thức. Tức người ta tạo một cái môi trường thuận lợi để cho những người giỏi cùng kết hợp và cùng cống hiến được cái tài năng của họ. Và do đó công việc nó mới triển khai.
Since the release of Spring Essence in 2000, linguists, lexicographers, and IT experts from various countries have partnered with the Nom Foundation to make the Nom script and the Han Nom heritage accessible on the internet to everybody, especially the young. In an interview in the US, Professor Balaban once said, "I hope Spring Essence will be a chance to change the image of a country that only spells war in the minds of American people." The fact that readers see this book as a bridge between the two cultures is an amazing thing.
Can you tell me what drew you to Ho Sung Hoong's poems and translating them?
At this point, I think it was Ho Sung Hoong herself. I mean, she's so clever in manipulating men that I think she just found the right person to do her work. I was pushed that way by people who love this Kayao, and they said, Ho Sung Hoong, that's the person you have to translate. No one told me how hard it would be. And it took 10 years to do about 50 poems.
Yes.
And that book came out in 2000. And it came out just as President Clinton was coming to Vietnam in November 2000. And he mentioned the book in his state dinner address. And that caused a lot of interest in it. And that interest has continued both among Vietnamese, of course, but also among Americans. And the book went on to have a real success as a book of poetry. Now, here was a woman who should not have been writing at all.
No.
She was a woman writing in a male Confucian tradition. She was writing in a time where women were, the Second Lei dynasty, which was falling apart, where the value of women was lessened considerably. In her time, women were even an aristocrat like herself. She was a cousin of Nguyen Huai, Emperor Quang Trung. She was impoverished, and she just was better than most of the men writing.
It took you over 10 years to translate all these
slow,
poems.
Right.
Well, I'm sure it was a lot of work. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey into translating Spring Essence?
Yeah, I started with the Kuk Nu. Had no idea at first that she even wrote in a different script, and I missed a lot of what she was doing at first. The Noi Lai, where you take a phrase, maybe 3 words, and then you turn it backwards. And when you do that, you also turn the tone around, and that's where it gets naughty, because she's never improper per se. It's only by tonal suggestion usually, sometimes by imagery. And that was hard for me to get. I had a friend come, Vietnamese woman, Ly Lan, poet herself, come to a class of mine, and as she was reading, she started laughing, and there was some Noi Lai that I had missed
that
before.
you have missed?
You want to hear one of those?
Yes.
Okay.
I would love to.
Okay. So it's called in Vietnamese, Deo Ba Zoi. Một Deo, Lai Một Deo. Ken ai keo, tak cảnh treo leo, cửa sân đỏ luyết, tổng hôm nóp, hòn đá sân rỉ, luân phân reo, lại leo khẳng thông, con nhỏ, con gió tháp, đậm địa lạ liễu, giọt sương gieo. Hiền nhân, quân tử, ai mà chẳng, mỗi gối, tròn chắn, văn muôn trèo. So she's obviously playing with the landscape, right? And there's a cavern with a red door and a ridge with a cleft and a black knoll. And there's a pine bough that's plunging in the wind. Of course, any reader of hers would know that pines are male and the willow that follows is female. But with her, when she says an honorific title for men, he and yun, guan tu, you almost are certain that in the next line she's going to zing them and make fun of the men in the poem. But in Vietnamese, the word deo has other meanings. And so when you get to deo the third time, a Vietnamese audience will get this. I won't go any further into the problem.
Leave it to our imaginations. What were the most daunting aspects of translating her poetry?
Making it poetry. I mean, I could have easily done a scholarly word-for-word translation that would have gotten the idea of what she's up to, but her music is so rich. The ta doing luet, the lusher, the regulated verse form is so precise that there wouldn't be any point in doing that. You would miss her almost completely unless you captured her music as well.
The New York Times noted that the publication of Spring Essence had become a phenomenon in the poetry scene in the U.S. The article was called Poet and Concubine, and I quote, "Balaban's deft translations are a beautiful and significant contribution to the West's growing awareness of Vietnam's splendid literary heritage." So what do you think Spring Essence contributed to the American understanding of Vietnamese literature?
It must have been a huge relief, especially for people who read poetry, and to hear about Vietnam in some way other than
the war.
That must have been a huge relief. I remember asking a Vietnamese friend, "What do you think Americans will make out of this book?" And he thought of me and he said, "He'll think Vietnamese are sexy."
That's for sure.
And then when other readers read her, I mean, her Buddhism, her Mahayana Buddhism was attractive as well.
So I was told that while translating Spring Essence, you wrote a beautiful and emotional poem in Vietnamese, inspired by Ho Xuân Hương. Do you have it with you, and could you read it to us?
Yeah, I don't know how emotional it is, but it was my only attempt to write a poem in Vietnamese. Do you want to try the Vietnamese?
Here I go. I'm going to give it a try at your poem. Hopefully it's a good rhythm. Ở bên trời Mỹ vẫn mơ, nguồn sông còn chảy, tình lờ lai dai. Trăm năm tiếng khéo ngân dài, trên sông cổ nguyệt nhớ hoài xuân hương.
Oh, thank you.
That's beautiful.
I'll tell you a nice story about that. I said goodbye to Tran Van Kay just before he left Paris to live in Vietnam again. And we said goodbye, and we both thought it might be the last time we'd see each other. And I went to the elevator to go down, and he called me back. And he said, "Balaban, this might be the last time we see each other." And he had his Dan Tran, and he looked at the poem in Vietnamese, and he put it to music immediately and played it against the Dan Tran. I wish so much I had that.
Tape recorder. That's amazing. In an effort to help rescue the precious heritage of Nom, professor and poet John Balaban established the Vietnamese Nom Preservation Foundation in 1999. One important mission of the foundation is digitalizing the immense repository of the Nom writings and poems, still existing in historic documents, steles, and sculpture. Digitalizing Nom documents discovered at the Thang Nghiem Pagoda is a striking example of the achievements of the Nom Foundation.
Thang Nghiem Buddhist Temple was founded 58 books had been photographed and processed by the time the Nom Foundation handed the project over to the library. Even though the project has ended, the Nom Foundation still supports the National Library in preserving its collection of old Han documents by working with international experts and looking for sponsors.
In recent years, the Vietnamese Nom Preservation Foundation has cooperated with the National Library, you've mentioned this earlier, to digitalize a great number of the historic Nom language books. Can you describe the project a little bit more?
Yeah. There's an estimated 4,000 texts at the National Library. Some of them are duplications, so it may not quite be 4,000. And we digitize a little more than half. There was a grant that we received from a group in Europe called the International Music and Arts Foundation. And then there was a grant from a group in California called the Chino Cienega Foundation. The two of them made it possible to hire people and train them to go to a manuscript. These are almost always ZAW paper, right? And we, at first, were afraid even to touch them. But then a great conservationist from Cornell University, John Dean, came, and you cut them apart. You put them on a special photographic table where everything is measured very carefully. So you always have the correct focus distance from the page. And then take a picture. It's color monitored. It goes into the computer. And then you have an archival photograph. And then the hard work begins to find all the metadata. When was it published? Exactly how big it is. Is there an author? And what, that sort of thing. And then the next step would be, which we haven't done, and that waits for somebody else, is to take one of those texts and to carry it and make it a searchable document. We've done that with Nguyen Xu's Tree and Keel. You can go to our website and see 5 versions, and you can go into them. And when we've done it, we put Spring Essence up recently too. But none of that has been done yet at the National Library. Right now, it's a physical record of high quality. So, and that meant 4 people working constantly. And when we left the project, because we gave our equipment to the National Library and trained their staff to do the work. That's our idea, not to stay at any place, but to
spread the knowledge.
Spread the knowledge, and if necessary, purchase the equipment and leave it so it can be used.
So since its birth, the Nom Foundation has done a lot of significant work to secure the treasures of the Nom scripts.
Yes.
What are the Foundation's main programs in this area over the past years,
Well, as I said, we represent Nom at the Idiographique Rapporteur group of the ISO standard, Unicode standard. We've created a dictionary, and we're about to help with the publication of an even bigger dictionary. We have a lookup tool on our website, so if you can, it even answers in English. It needs to be better than it is, but it's still a beginning. So people all over the world, including scholars, are using that lookup tool. There's a dictionary on our website as well. On our website, we wanted to create an archive of important Nom works like Tree and Keo, Luk Van Tien, and other works. We digitize the Dai Viet Chu Ki. We're only volunteers, all of whom have jobs doing something else, earning a living. We have 3, sometimes 4 people who work for us on salary in Vietnam, but everybody on the board of directors volunteers their time and money.
It's amazing. So I can tell that it takes a lot of time and effort and great devotion to do this. What obstacles does the Vietnamese Nom Language Foundation face in realizing this mission? Money. So we should encourage everyone that's watching.
I mean, you can contribute through PayPal if you want, but no, we could do a lot more if we had more people, and to have more people, you'd have to have more money to pay them.
Yeah. And finally, for myself, and I think for many in the audience here today, what is it that drives an American professor, to become so deeply involved and engaged in the preservation of the cultural treasure like Vietnamese Nom script?
It's fascinating all by itself. I mean, in the U.S., people ask that question and they think it has something to do with the war. And obviously it does, but I probably would have gone on to do something else if there hadn't been a war. But the war led me to a Vietnam that was beyond the war, a Vietnam that was deeper. And that led me to its literature, as far as I can go with my limited abilities, really. But it's a fascinating study. And, to have some insight into something like that and not do anything about it just would be peculiar and strange.
It would be a waste.
Be a waste,
yeah. Well, I'm definitely grateful that you're doing this.
Well, it's fun.
Myself, as a young Vietnamese that's lived, abroad, it's great to have this, insight. You're kind of giving me a peek of what Vietnamese culture is about, and that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, John Balaban, for this enlightening conversation. I know that your affair with the Vietnamese folk poetry and Nom writings will continue.
They will. Thank you.
From all of us here at VTV, please know that we hope the Vietnamese Nom Language Foundation will enjoy further support and the joining hands from other enthusiasts.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today's edition of Talk Vietnam. I hope you enjoyed our show today, and I hope you'll join us next week.